Bonjour et merci pour m'inviter. Je suis très content d'être ici. Je vais parler anglais. Excusez-moi. I'm going to speak about rhetoric and deliberation, but I'm not going to speak about the emotions or the passions. So often that when one hears about rhetoric, one thinks that that will be the topic. But part of what I'd like to show today is that the rhetorical perspective brings more than that to the discussions of deliberation. So I'd like to begin with a problem that Simone Chambers raised in her recent article on deliberative democracy, in which she asks, or she urges theorists not to give up on the idea of deliberation in mass democracy. She doesn't, I think, oppose thinking about micro-publics and small groups, but she wants to draw our attention to the fact that that movement within deliberative democratic theory seems sometimes to give up on the possibility of having a deliberative form of speech in mass democratic settings. The challenge she identifies there is the challenge of what she calls plebiscitary rhetoric, which at one point she summarizes in this way: plebiscitary rhetoric follows the rule, say anything to be elected. This is one of the challenges in mass democracy. Now, what I'd like to say today from the rhetorical perspective is a certain line of thought which indicates, I'm afraid, how very deep that problem is in modern representative democracies, and that the problem for making mass democratic speech deliberative comes not just from the size of the audience or the scene, nor especially from the tendency to aim at the passions or the emotions, nor from the asymmetric speech situation in which a very few people do the speaking and a very many do the listening, nor from the presence of media or the dominant impact of money on the system. All of those things are important. But what I'd like to suggest today is that there is a deeper challenge that rhetoric and mass democracies face in trying to be deliberative. But in order to get to that point and to give a sense of the rhetorical perspective that I'm coming from, I'd like to just spend a few minutes on describing how deliberation looks from a certain rhetorical perspective. If we think about deliberation, we can think of it as a process of belief formation or will formation. But the classical rhetoricians would immediately notice that there are various ways that we seem to come to beliefs and to decisions. One way might be through a logical argument, certainly. One way might be hearing a statement by someone whom we trust, and because we trust that person, we're likely to believe what they say. The emotions may also be involved, but I'm not going to talk about them. So let me think a bit about the trust part of it, which has come up in a number of presentations during this conference. One way to think about, in fact, I've recently changed the way that I think about the role of trust. One way to think about it, which had been my old way of thinking about it, was that when you trust a person, you're more likely to pay attention to the logical argument they present. And if that logic is compelling, then the reason for your belief would be the logic. And the trust played an auxiliary role, a supplemental role. But the problem with that is there are cases when the arguments that a speaker is making do not change at all, and yet our belief in the conclusion changes entirely. And those are cases when we finally, when we discover some facts about the speaker outside what they're saying. Perhaps it's a conflict of interest that they have. If they're giving an argument for regulating the tobacco industry and it turns out that they're paid by that industry, we may suddenly reevaluate our belief in the conclusion they've drawn, even though they make precisely the same logical argument. And there are a number of cases. John Dryzek has mentioned a few of them in some of his recent work on deliberative democracy. Now, that suggests, well, one way of interpreting that is that the belief that we have after hearing arguments, that the arguments play this role. The arguments give us evidence of the trustworthiness of the person making them. But in the end, it's the trustworthiness of the person that finally is the source of our belief. And so the evidence given by the validity or lack of validity of their argumentation is one piece of evidence that we use to draw a conclusion about their trustworthiness, but there may be other pieces of evidence too, such as evidence we may get about conflicts of interest, or too often rumors that may be spread about them, or advertisements with frightening music and shadowy images on television, or in other settings, in judicial settings, victims may be made to parade in front of a jury crying and tearing their hair out. So there's a certain room, there is room for emotion there. But in general, there's room for other evidence about the trustworthiness of the speaker besides that provided by the quality of their argumentation. But on that account, as I say, which I think of as a rhetorical account, it can be found, I think, in Aristotle's Rhetoric. In many ways, it's a radical view of the role of argument. But even if we accept that radical view, one may still say that we want to promote deliberation, meaning promote argument, which would mean that we'd like people to aim to gain, we'd like speakers to aim to gain the trust of their audience through making arguments, rather than through doing other things, introducing music, images, rumors, shadows. Now, this is one way, I think, of redescribing the problem that Simone Chambers described of plebiscitary rhetoric. To say anything to get elected aims at the outcome of producing a certain belief or choice or vote, in fact, in action. So that outcome is all that matters. That is what one can call the external end. But you might also describe a kind of rhetoric which would be deliberative rhetoric, which would be the sort that aimed to certainly persuade or produce a belief or an action, but that aimed to do so through the use of argumentation. And so the use of argumentation would would comprise a separate internal end, one could call it, internal to the activity of rhetoric of itself. So that would lead us to redescribe Chambers' question in this way: what conditions would encourage speakers to aim at the internal end of proceeding through argument as well as the external end, or would preserve the possibility of aiming at that internal end, or more simply at persuading through argument rather than through other means? Well, let me, that's just to restate the question in a certain way. Let me, if you'll indulge me, go back to Aristotle in a little bit more detail for a moment to see how he dealt or answered that question. And then in the third and last part of the talk, I will come back to present-day modern representative mass democracies with his argument in mind, though not, it won't be possible to apply his argument directly, of course. But Aristotle defended rhetoric, certainly, but opposed the sophists. And one could say that the sophists aimed at the, taught a practice of rhetoric which aimed at the external end of pleasing or persuading. But Aristotle wanted to make argument, deliberation, more central to the art of rhetoric. Now, deliberation meant for him a number of things, but included in deliberation must be, one, deciding together a matter of common concern about an action in the future. What should we do? That is the context for deliberation. So it's specific in terms of being about a particular action, and that specificity focuses both the speaker's and the audience's attention in a certain way. This notion of deliberation is separate from a process which is often confused with it, which is the process of discussion followed by decision by vote. And talking with Philippe Urfolino, I've recently been thinking more about this. It seems to me crucial. There might be a discussion which helps individuals to deliberate internally, and then to finish their deliberation, and then to express the conclusion of that deliberation in a vote. but that's something a bit from truly deliberating, something different from truly deliberating together. But I'll let Philippe or Felina say more about that at some point. But these are characteristics of deliberation for Aristotle. But the other characteristic is that there is an implicit standard in that sort of deliberation about what to do, which is, he says, the standard of advantage. One may use a number of standards, justice, what's beautiful or noble, but in the end, the standard that rules discussions of what to do is advantage, what will be good for us in the end. It doesn't have to be a crude or crass notion of advantage. One could expand it in any way one wishes. It may include being just for various reasons, but in the end, that standard governs these kinds of discussions. The audience is implicitly, as soon as they think of themselves as thinking about what to do, they are implicitly attached to that standard. And therefore, speakers who speak to them have good reason to frame what they say in terms of considerations about that standard. So it may be that they still aim, they are still rhetoricians, they still are quite aware of the fact that whether or not they will be believed will depend in the end, most of all, on whether they are trusted. And they may aim to be trusted, rather than aiming to make the best logical argument about the subject matter in front of them. But the situation gives them an incentive to aim to gain that trust through argumentation. So the function of the rhetorical setting is tied, in this analysis, to the sort of rhetorical practice that goes on inside of it. It seems to me this is linked to Bernard's talk as well, in that a discussion that proceeds by the principle of contradiction, arguing pro and contra, is natural in certain settings, which, in other words, the number, having only two options, two opposing viewpoints as opposed to 3 or 5 or more, that's natural when you have a proposed action put in front of you and you're hearing arguments for and against that proposal. The number 2 is not arbitrary in that case. So there again, the nature of the question posed, the precise function of the deliberation that ensues gives rise to a certain kind of rhetorical activity. So that is, in Aristotle, how he approaches this challenge of trying to promote efforts to produce beliefs through argumentation. One has to pay attention to the form of the rhetorical situation, very close attention to it, and he believes that focusing on specific questions about what to do in the future, that is more likely to give rise to a sort of rhetoric in which arguments play an important role. Now, if we turn, in the last part of what I'd like to say, if we turn to contemporary liberal democracies with that structure of thought in mind, we certainly still find assemblies that have to decide what to do at certain moments, including what laws to pass. But we also find, I think, that is not the most visible or powerful rhetorical situation in the polity in mass representative governments. Instead, one might say the exemplary mode of rhetoric, of political rhetoric, is campaign rhetoric that aims to amass support for certain politicians, less and less often for certain parties or policies, though that's still obviously important. But campaigns differ from deliberative assemblies because their function does not seem to suggest any particular predefined master standard or criterion in the way that the particular kind of situation described by Aristotle as a deliberative one does. Politicians running for office sometimes seem to be talking about rendering a just verdict on actions in the past, but they often also talk about choosing policies for the future. And in political science, the discussion of prospective and retrospective voting points to this Janus-faced nature of campaign rhetoric. Such rhetoric can't easily be classified, certainly according to Aristotle's scheme. It is both judicial and deliberative at once, often epideitic also. But more important than that fact is that it can't readily be classified in any way that would provide an implicit and specific master criterion which naturally generates focused argumentation. So I think that campaign rhetoric is less susceptible to a strategy analogous to the one that Aristotle deployed when he showed how arguing could be made central to rhetoric. Now, there is one master criterion or standard that sometimes seems to be at work in campaign rhetoric, and that might be called representativeness. Our political rhetoric is filled to the brim with claims about who most accurately represents the people. Debates about substantive matters are often channeled through the language of representation. And you could say that representativeness, in turn, is largely about trustworthiness. So campaign rhetoric is often largely about whom to trust. And we've already seen that there's a sense in which all argument may be said to be partly about that question. But there's nevertheless a difference of emphasis, I think, in campaign rhetoric, where deliberative rhetoric, in at least this idealized situation I've described, encourages argument about what the best course of action would be, and it allows judgments about speakers' characters to arise from observing those arguments. Campaign rhetoric does not culminate, strictly speaking, in a decision about action. It culminates instead of a choice of a person. The case of more deeply party-based electoral systems is slightly different. That would have to be treated separately. But campaign rhetoric aimed at electing individuals does not channel rhetoric into a particular argumentative path as strongly as deliberative rhetoric can. Deliberative assemblies offer a kind of gladiatorial ring, a ring for gladiators, in which politicians perform and display their virtues in the course of pursuing certain goals that cannot be achieved without at least some substantive argument. We get to see how political leaders play a certain game, and the game is selected to be one whose skills are related somehow to the skills of governing. So in playing that game, they give us valuable evidence about their character and their trustworthiness. But campaigns seem to aim more directly at the goal of being trusted and elected. There's no particular argumentative contest that must be waged and judged as a means to winning that approval, except in occasional and often badly designed debates. As we saw earlier, judgments about whom to trust can be made on the basis of arguments always. There's room in campaign rhetoric for argument, but Aristotle in the Rhetoric stipulates that he means by character only the impression of character that we get from speech itself. But in a campaign situation in general, we can't make that stipulation. There are many sources of evidence about politicians' characters outside of their own words. Therefore, the importance of representativeness, trust, and character does not itself offer a strong incentive to make arguments or substantive policy debates a central part of campaigns. In fact, representativeness seems often to offer a way of avoiding such debates. Conditions often seem to be such that there's little reason to think that aiming at the internal end of finding plausible arguments will be a promising way to pursue the external end of getting elected. Now, what encouraged the alignment of internal and external ends in Aristotle's idealized deliberative setting was the fact that the audience for each kind of rhetoric was participating in a particular part of the activity of ruling. But in modern representative democracies, citizens who are voting are not participating in ruling exactly. They are judging the rulers. And so their thinking is not as thoroughly structured by the criteria implicit in those ruling activities. They judge from the perspective of their place in civil society, and their criteria are often taken directly from their interests and tastes as private individuals. In appealing to people who are using these standards, campaign rhetoric resembles advertising. Advertising aims to create a sale just as campaigns aim to create a vote. The external end dominates in both cases. And the devaluing of internal ends of activities is a familiar feature of markets in general. Insofar as political campaigns do resemble market competitions for votes, as many political scientists think they do, they will be indifferent to the distinctive internal ends of argumentative rhetoric, and therefore in practice they will tend to encourage the easier and apparently more efficient plebiscitory sort of rhetoric, say anything to get elected. Now this line of thought, I think, helps to put more familiar observations about modern conditions of rhetoric in mass democracies in perspective. Certainly, it's true that the growth of markets, the subsequent privatization of formerly public arenas have posed a challenge to traditional sorts of rhetoric and oratory. It's also true that changes in the media have emphasized visual communication, short format speech, less conducive to sophisticated argumentation. It's also true that changing practices and technologies of public opinion research and speech writing have had noticeable effects on the intellectual content of public speech, on the strategies adopted. It's also true that the organization and funding and technology of the modern media help to shape campaign rhetoric. And I would say, in general, the conjunction of markets and media has given rise to the phenomenal importance of advertising as a mode of influence, certainly the most common form of rhetoric in today's developed societies. The growth of commercial society, the sociological effects of that growth, fragmentation of traditional communities, individualism, pressure for commensurability among different spheres of life, all of these and related phenomena, it's true, must be taken into account to give a full explanation of rhetoric's current state. But I think these developments are all made possible by the structural political situation that the very form of representative government, as it now exists in the United States and France, creates. The audience for the new media and the consumers for the new markets live in a realm of civil society that exists not by nature, but as a result of political systems that limit themselves from colonizing it. Limited government creates civil society, and civil society makes possible modern media, markets, and advertising. The defining feature of the private sphere is that its discourse is not wholly structured around the imperatives and activities of ruling and the standards that those activities suggest. That freedom is an advantage in many ways, but it's precisely, I'm tempted to think, what makes non-deliberative rhetoric, non-argumentative rhetoric, more likely. One well-known study in the United States about presidential rhetoric by Jeffrey Toulis shows how much it's changed since the early days of the Republic, with presidents much more likely now to address the public as a whole. Essentially, what he was noticing was that the audience for presidential rhetoric has shifted from individuals situated within political institutions with delineated functions, legislators, to individuals situated simply in civil society. The change does not necessitate plebiscitary rhetoric, but arguably it removes some of the institutional encouragements to pursue deliberative, argumentative rhetoric. It suggests that the distinctive problem that modern liberal democracies pose for deliberative rhetoric is not the mere existence of a mass public, not simply a problem of size or scale, also not the mediated way in which such a public relates to one another and to their leaders. Nor is it simply the asymmetrical relationship between speakers and audience. Related to those issues, but more fundamental to them, is the fact that the structure of the regime puts citizens in a position to judge political rhetoric from a position outside of any defined role in the actual activity of ruling. Those activities, deciding what to do, judging the justice of what has happened, are ones that suggest particular criteria and therefore implicitly call forth at least some substantive argument. The difficulty of encouraging deliberative rhetoric may be linked then to the distinctive structure of modern representative government itself, to the fact that it puts ordinary citizens in the role of an audience tasked primarily with watching and judging political rule from the outside rather than doing it for themselves. If there's any truth at all in that diagnosis, then the usual calls for media responsibility and civic education will only go so far in making our rhetoric more deliberative.